Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of Waste 360's Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte. My name is Charlotte Dreisen, and I am really excited to be here today to talk all things litter, which is a topic that most of us probably think about, if not every day, almost every day when we are walking to the grocery store or taking an exit off of the highway. Unfortunately, the reality today is that there is a lot of litter in the United States, an estimated 50 billion pieces, or almost 152 pieces per person, as estimated by Keep America Beautiful, which is a lot, something that we confront on roadways and waterways and most places in between. So we're going to talk today about why we have so much litter, where it comes from, what is it made of, what are cities doing about it, and why and how people litter. Some really interesting research on behavior and how and why folks are finding themselves using a trash and recycling bin or not. That's coming out as of late. So without further ado, what is litter? Litter is essentially any waste that is unmanaged, whether it's intentionally escaping the solid waste stream or unintentionally escaping the solid waste stream. It can be something that, a candy wrapper that someone is directly throwing off of the sidewalk or out of a moving vehicle, all the way to overflowing trash and recycling bins, whether they're in a park or at your home, or overflowing trash and recycling coming out of a waste truck that is transporting material to a transfer station or a MRF or a landfill or a waste to energy facility. It can come from a lot of different places. The vast majority, more than 90% of litter, is estimated to be under the 4-inch threshold. There's a lot of different folks that use different barometers to kind of categorize the size of litter and what it's made of, but suffice it to say that most is on the smaller side. Certainly, there is a lot of illegal dumping that goes on where there might be a full mattress or construction debris that's littered on the side of a road. That definitely makes up a meaningful portion of litter, but in terms of item count, we're generally talking about smaller items as a whole, which highlights one of the really challenging things about tracking data and measuring litter as we have it in the US today. And that's that most of the data we have is by item count. This can be really helpful to get a sense of what kinds of material qualitatively is out there, but it can make it a little bit challenging to figure out what the total volume and weight of certain materials are. Knowing that different materials weigh vastly different amounts of weight by gram or pound or ton, it can be hard to kind of make those comparisons across project count and tonnage. And as we all know, most of us think about tonnage when it comes to solid waste in the trash and recycling community. So I'm officially putting my wish in for the holidays this year to have more litter data by tonnage, but most of the data we have today is by item count. Most of that data, too, is estimated at the national level. Keep America Beautiful, or KAB, does a lot of this work and spends a lot of time and attention on the issue of litter as a whole. Their 2020 National Litter Survey is one of the best resources that we have to estimate how much litter is all around us on a daily basis. And knowing that the last resource they have is from 2020, it also starts to capture some of the litter that we've seen over the course of the pandemic and starts to measure how much and what kind of PPE that we're seeing in the environment escaping our formal solid waste management systems. As we talked a little bit about earlier on, there are an estimated 50 billion pieces of litter in the US, which works out to a little over 150 pieces per person. This is a lot. It translates to more than 2,000 pieces of litter per mile along roadways and waterways. Not only does Keep America Beautiful start to quantify the amount of litter and the number of pieces of litter that we have, but they also start to look at where it's taking place and comparing and contrasting from roadways to waterways. One of the findings that they have is that we have more litter in terms of the density of pieces of litter around waterways, but more than 70% of bodies of water are within about a quarter of a mile of a road. So there's clearly a really strong geographic linkage there. That once it starts on the road, it often trickles its way through the environment towards a waterway, where it'll go through streams to bigger rivers to eventually the ocean. A lot of a really interesting discussion there that we had in one of our recent episodes on ocean plastic. So very much encourage you to take a look there if you want to dive into the waterway situation and the kinds of materials that we're finding in the ocean and bigger bodies of water as well. But as a whole, KAB provides a really important job in tracking and measuring change in litter over time. We really didn't start to conceptualize litter as an environmental issue until the 1970s, so a lot of the earliest data we have is just before then in 1969. KAB finds that we've had a reduction of about 61% of litter since 1969, which is a really impressive reduction. Even more impressive when you think about that 54% of litter has been reduced since just 2009, which really shows that we didn't do a whole lot in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, early 2000s, that we really started to lean into litter prevention and reduction and mitigation in the late 2000s and into the teens. So really starting in 2009, we see huge emphasis there, and we've seen a really meaningful reduction in a lot of different kinds of materials and packaging formats. We've seen big reductions in cigarettes, in fast food packaging, in PET soda bottles. For cigarettes, it's been almost a four-fold increase, a 70% increase since 2009, which is really aggressive and is much more rapid of a decrease than the reduction that we've seen in smoking. So we know that, of course, less folks are smoking today than they were in the early 2000s, but we've been able to reduce litter for cigarettes by a bigger margin than that. We'll look at in just a little bit some studies that are looking at the incidence rate of litter for material in general, as well as cigarettes. And we still see, unfortunately, that cigarettes make up the biggest item by count in our litter today, and the highest incidence rate of litter as a whole, with about a 65% rate. More folks flicking a cigarette onto the ground into the environment than not. But for the material that we do have being littered, we have unfortunately seen some increases in some materials. We've seen increases in plastic film food packaging, in cardboard, and in beer containers. One of the really big takeaways that I had reading KAB's study is that alcoholic beverage containers are more than 2 times as likely to be littered than non-alcoholic beverage containers, which is a really striking difference. Not only was that a big takeaway for me, but a couple other really important observations that KAB highlights. One is that for bottle bill states that have policies that require deposits of 5 cents or 10 cents on beverage containers, they see that the incidence rate of litter for those covered items is a ratio of about 2 to 1 compared to states that don't have those bottle bill policies, which is a really big reduction, showing just how important bottle bill deposits and policies are for the collection and recycling of those materials, as well as preventing the littering of those items. One of the other big takeaways I had related to PPE and COVID-related material and waste. We talk in one of our recent episodes solely about COVID and the effect of PPE on the environment, about some interesting findings about how we can try and recover them. But unfortunately, a whole lot of PPE by count is getting out into the environment, about 207 million as estimated nationally. The majority of it was about 70% were plastic gloves, though, not masks, which really confounded my expectations of what kind of PPE we'd have escaping into the environment. That was definitely an unexpected result that I found. But certainly no shortage of material as a whole that we need to better manage and contain and ensure is staying in the formally managed trash and hopefully one day recycling system, although we have very few recycling opportunities for PPE today, whether they are single-use plastic gloves or masks or reusable ones. Now, when we think about the kind of material that's being littered, one of the challenging things about having most data by item count is that it makes it challenging to convert into tonnage and really assess the kinds of materials versus another that's being littered into the environment. Some, of course, we know are perhaps more problematic than others, with items like plastic often generating microplastics in the marine environment, whereas other items like glass or metals like aluminum and steel don't tend to break apart in the same way that some plastics do. For the kinds of materials that we do see by item count, however, we see that about 38% is made of plastic, about 15% is made of paper, about 7% for metal and glass, as well as about 2 to 3% of organics. A really big chunk is about 28% is other items that might be illegally dumped furniture and materials that don't strictly fit into those categories. It's been really exciting to see that overall 54% reduction of litter since 2009, between 2009 and 2020, but it's also important to think about the rates of decrease that we've seen for items. We talked a little bit about a few packaging formats a moment ago, but in terms of the materials that we're seeing in the environment that are being littered today, we have about a 17% reduction for plastic and a bigger reduction of about 39% for all other materials. They're showing us that not all materials are coming along at the same rate and that there's room to improve there for sure. One of the most heartening findings, I think, though, is that 90% of Americans say that litter is an issue in their community, showing really broad buy-in that litter is an issue that deserves attention and strategies to mitigate and prevent. However, we do know that a lot of people litter. Is it just those 10% that say it's not an issue to them, or is there some overlap with people thinking litter is an issue but being responsible for some litter themselves? It's a really hard question to investigate, and there's some really interesting studies that are coming out analyzing behavior of folks and if and when they're littering. Not only are there some really interesting studies examining behavior and trying to pick apart the trends from the data that we have of material that's littered in the environment, but there's also some really interesting experiments that are being run. One of those really interesting experiments looks at whether folks litter when a flyer is left on their parked car and examines whether or not the area around them being clean is a factor in that process. The study found that 14% of people littered when the area was clean and well kept, a pretty small percentage, although 14% feels really high, when the area was clean, and that a much bigger percentage, 32%, littered the flyer that was left on their windshield if the area was already dirty and chock full of litter to begin with. This highlights one of the phenomena that are most important to consider when it comes to solid waste management of litter, and that's what we call the broken glass theory, that someone is more apt to have kind of unconventional, non-conforming behavior like littering if the area that they're in has graffiti, is dirty, not well managed, and has litter present to begin with. So we definitely see a relationship between litter occurring in an area where there is already litter present. It seems to be a big catalyst across the board in communities throughout the US, and that's definitely echoed in communities outside of North America as well. We also talked a little bit about where litter comes from, whether it's people intentionally littering, whether they're unintentionally doing it, whether it comes from them walking around or from a car or from an overflowing trash and recycling bin or a vehicle. And a lot of studies have also looked into this aspect. About 70% seems to come from people littering, about 50% from people in cars, as well as about 18% of people who are walking around, pedestrians, which is really heartening that when folks are out immersed in their community and environment, that they are less likely to litter, but unfortunate to know that if someone is driving by at a high speed, perhaps not from the area, maybe commuting, that they may have less of an attachment to the community and are a bit more inclined to litter than they would otherwise be. About 20% of litter comes from unsecured vehicle traffic. So solid waste vehicles, trash trucks, recycling trucks that may have kind of a trail of material unfortunately leaving behind them, whether material wasn't fully compacted or is just caught on the vehicle. We all have seen this take place, and unfortunately is a reality that workers who are on the front line are always keeping an eye out for and can do an improved job. Or, certainly that data seems to suggest there's room for improvement. About 5% of litter comes from vehicles themselves, which is a really interesting source of litter I don't think I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And that's when cars crash, bits and pieces of the hood and of the lights and different components breaks off and is littered on the roadway. Only about 2 or 3% is estimated to come from overflowing containers that might be in a park or on a sidewalk or at your home. I've got to say that number seems really low to me, just anecdotally from working in Washington, D.C., and I would be really curious to see some more detailed work there, estimating what the span is for commercial dumpsters versus residential waste bins, and to start kind of providing increased clarity there. I've got to say, I would be fascinated to see what those numbers look like. There are some general tenets that scientists have been able to observe from these studies that seem pretty universal across the board, no matter what community you might find yourself in. They take snapshots and samples from hundreds of communities nationwide. They find that littering is almost always an intentional act, with more than 80%, 81% of folks that litter having an intentionality about it, that they're making a very concerted effort to release a cup from their grasp or release a candy bar wrapper from their grasp, and don't seem to really have an intent there of getting it into a trash or recycling bin. A minority of folks seem to, be shooting for a trash and recycling bin and might have it, miss the mark, and they've already turned away, not realizing, for instance. They also find that perhaps unsurprisingly, people are more likely to litter when they have trash or recycling bins farther away. In fact, when they're more than 60 feet away from a trash and recycling bin, the rate of littering is threefold what it is when they're less than 10 feet away. So we definitely see that iteratively, as you add more distance to someone in a trash and recycling bin, that it increases their likelihood to litter, unfortunately. It also suggests that placement is probably pretty important. Not only is distance as the crow flies, but whether they have to take a winding path to get there, whether there's obstacles or benches or who knows what in their way. I think a lot of room for increased research there to qualitatively think through what stands between someone and a trash and recycling bin. Would also be really curious to see how this compares between trash and recycling, since, a lot of the data we have really groups these two together. But, thinking through how far will someone go to reach a recycling bin if they have a trash bin that's closer, would be a really fascinating area of study that folks could explore further. A few other generalities have been able to be teased out from these efforts and studies. One is that unfortunately, younger folks are more likely to litter than older. That is a pretty universal observation that we've been able to make. We've also been able to determine that men are more likely to litter than women, though gender isn't a really big, important predictor in littering behavior. And perhaps most interestingly, it's found that the average littering rate is usually about 17%. Really interesting, and I think a huge amount of room to explore further, whether this is the same, whether one is on on foot, on a bike, on a scooter, in a vehicle, in their own vehicle versus someone else, how it's impacted if someone is alone versus in a group. One of my favorite data points of all time in the solid waste space is that men are 10% more likely to recycle if there's at least one woman present in the household, albeit that data point came from Europe, but I would like to think that it probably rings true in the US as well. I would be fascinated whether littering rates go down if you are with at least one person, and perhaps some insight into qualitatively who you are with is a relation to you. So now we've talked a lot about where litter comes from, how much of it is generated. Let's talk a little bit about how cities are working to abate litter. Some of the really core strategies that are used in almost all communities is street sweeping. Really big, slow-moving trucks to kind of vacuum up and sweep streets and collect not only littered items, but also things like leaves, which make up a really big portion of the items that can clog, drainage systems and really be a nuisance to people, vehicles, all of the above. There are also a lot of educational campaigns that are out there. In Washington, D.C., we have trash traps and a very active division of our Department of Energy and Environment that's dedicated to litter abatement and mitigation. Communities in Baltimore and elsewhere have really funky contraptions that float on waterways. Baltimore has the really beloved Mr. Trash Wheel. We talk about this more in our ocean plastic video, but very much encourage you to check them out on Instagram if you haven't already. But there are all sorts of strategies to collect and manage litter once it's introduced into waterways. It is always easier to grab it from land than from water, and if it has made its way into a waterway, easier to get it from a smaller stream or river rather than a bigger one or the ocean, relatively speaking, in terms of ease and cost and difficulty, you name it. Now, all of these efforts to collect and manage litter are really expensive. Street sweeping is estimated to run anywhere from $18 a mile to $35 a mile, but can really range hugely and even beyond that on the higher side when you consider the need for parking enforcement and removal and towing of vehicles that are blocking street sweepers' way. You may have heard of alternative street parking, which is really aimed at getting cars off of one side of the street so street sweepers can come down and collect litter and other material that might be present in the street. And that is really hard to do if vehicles are parked in your way. So a lot of time and energy is spent by public works departments and sanitation departments in simply enabling street sweeping to come through. That has an enormous cost. Not only is the cost of street sweeping operations really onerous, but of course the collection and management of litter beyond the street is also really difficult to do. The farther it is from that asphalt, the more challenging and expensive and time-consuming it is. Folks estimate that litter has an annual cost to the U.S. of about $11 billion a year, which if you weren't moved from an environmental and wildlife perspective to begin with, hopefully that is a compelling data point to lean on. We know that unfortunately today, littering has spiked during the pandemic in the US. Certainly isn't a huge spike, but is an uptick relative to the decrease that we've seen over the past 10, 15 years. So hopefully a trend that is not sustained, but really underscores the need for attention and time and resources to be paid towards litter and education campaigns to help people understand just how damaging it is and to really work to reduce that overall litter incidence rate of 17%. One of the big pieces of this is enforcement. Almost every community on the books has requirements and laws that prohibit littering, but very few of them enforce them, and it is admittedly a really challenging thing to enforce. We've seen some really exciting movement of using video cameras to enforce and prosecute people who litter in communities like New York, for instance. In Washington, D.C., we unfortunately do not flex the $75 fine we have for littering very often. In many communities, it is much, much higher than that. In California, it could range from anywhere from $100 to $1,000. In a lot of states and communities, there's community service requirements to pick up litter if you are caught littering. This all really demonstrates that the stronger the fine is and community service requirement, as well as the more robust the enforcement, the less likely littering is to happen. And that unfortunately, it can be a self-propelling cycle. So it's really important to invest in to ensure that it doesn't creep up in the first place, or it's going to be a much bigger challenge to tackle. We can often look to a lot of communities like those in Asia and Singapore, for instance, that have really onerous littering requirements and laws on the books. They outright have a fee of $1,000 for a first-time offender for littering, but consequently, their communities are really, really clean and they have almost a zero littering issue. Very little street sweeping needed when you don't have littering in the first place. So dividends are really likely to be observed when investing on the front end to reduce incidents of litter in the first place. There's also really important health concerns when items like pet waste are littered, and that ends up into the water system, washing both directly into our waterways as well as our wastewater treatment systems. These were a lot of considerations around litter that we've talked to, how much we see, why people do it, when they do it, and how cities are responding. But these are by no means all of the important considerations to think about with litter. There are mental health concerns, impacts to local businesses, environmental justice considerations. I'm really looking forward to getting into all of those 201 concepts in a future video and exploring them with you all. Please, as always, feel free to drop any comments, questions, thoughts right below this video on Waste 360's website, or as always, shoot me a message on Instagram at Char Recycles or on Twitter at Chardreizen, Chardreizen. Thanks so much for joining this week's episode of Unpacking Recycling with Charlotte.